The tea room is quiet when you arrive. The kettle is there, it always is, but it is cold. No one mentions this at first. The cups are on the table, the chairs are pulled out. Everything looks ready, and yet nothing is happening. Someone glances at the kettle, not because they need tea, because waiting has started to feel noticeable. Stillness used to mean care. Now it reads as neglect. Time stretches without ceremony. No one has said how long this will take. No one has said what should happen next. This absence begins to itch. Waiting feels exposed now, unproductive, as if something is being forgotten. A hand hovers near the switch. Not out of urgency, out of discomfort. We have learned to distrust silence. We assume that if nothing is happening, something has gone wrong. Speed has become a proxy for concern. Quick answers feel attentive. Immediate action feels responsible. The kettle remains cold. The water inside it is still. Nothing visible is changing. This looks like waste. It is not. Preparation often looks like nothing. It happens below the surface, without feedback, without proof. Stillness gives no reassurance. It offers no metrics, no progress bar, no voice explaining what it is doing. This is why waiting feels unsafe. Not because it is harmful, because it is quiet. A decision is made without being announced. The switch is flipped. Heat is applied. Impatience reframes itself as decisiveness. Action replaces uncertainty. Everyone relaxes slightly. At the center of the room, the monk pauses. He watches the kettle begin to hum. He says that rushing is often just anxiety wearing the costume of care. Then he steps back. The kettle warms quickly now. There is sound. There is movement. There is evidence. This feels better. Something is happening. But the timing has shifted. The process has been shortened. What could have settled has been interrupted. Nothing will fail because of this. The tea will still be made, but something small has been lost. The tea room notices how often intervention replaces trust, how frequently speed stands in for attention. The kettle continues to heat. The room grows quieter again. Waiting resumes, but it is no longer the same kind of waiting. At the far end of the table, the monk speaks once more. He says that delay is not absence, and stillness is not neglect. Then he lets the kettle continue on its own. The kettle hums softly now, not loudly, just enough to remind everyone that something is underway. Nothing else changes. The table remains the same. The cups wait. Conversation does not improve simply because heat has begun. This is the difficult part. When something is happening but not yet finished. Attention drifts. Someone checks the room. Someone checks themselves. Someone assumes this should be quicker by now. Slowness asks for trust. Trust is expensive. There is no visible progress, no indication of how close the water is to boiling, no reassurance that waiting is being rewarded. This is where impatience grows teeth. The kettle makes a different sound now, a subtle change. Those who are listening notice it. Those who are not grow restless. Waiting without feedback feels unsafe. It creates space for doubt. Have we done this right? Should something else be happening? Did we miss a step? Certainty thrives on immediacy. Waiting gives it nowhere to stand. The kettle reaches its limit. There is a click. Silence returns. Relief spreads through the room. Completion has been declared. The water is poured immediately, too quickly. No one suggests pausing. The leaves are submerged without ceremony. Time is not given back to the tea. It steeps, but briefly, just enough. The cups are filled. The color is right. The ritual appears complete. At the center of the room, the monk pauses again. He lifts a cup and smells it. He says that finishing is not the same as arriving. Then he sets the cup down untouched. The tea tastes thin. Not wrong, just shallow. No one complains. It would be impolite. The process was followed. The steps were completed. Speed did not ruin the tea. It reduced it. The tea room notices how often this is enough, how frequently adequacy replaces depth. Waiting was the work, but it was treated as an obstacle, something to be endured rather than participated in. The kettle has done its job, so has the water. The tea has done what it could in the time allowed. What was missing was patience, not dramatically, just quietly. The cups sit on the table. They will be finished. The room will move on. Nothing is broken. But the taste will not linger. At the far end of the table, the monk speaks once more. He says that urgency never announces what it costs. Then he leaves the cup where it is and steps away from the table. The tea room settles. The kettle cools. The room grows still again. Waiting returns. This time, it is noticed. The tea room is quiet when you enter. The tea has already been poured. The cups are warm. Steam rises faintly. Nothing has been disturbed. On the table sits the sugar bowl. It has a lid. It always does. No one comments on it immediately. Some choices feel insignificant because they are familiar. No one announces them. No one explains themselves. Sugar or no sugar is rarely framed as a moral question. It is taste. It is preference. It is habit. The lid is lifted. Comfort is not a weakness. That idea arrives early and stays late, usually without being questioned. Warmth is pleasant. Sweetness is pleasant. Relief is pleasant. Bodies prefer these things for understandable reasons. There is nothing suspicious about this. Sugar makes tea easier to drink. It softens bitterness. It smooths edges. It allows the liquid to move more easily from cup to throat. No one apologizes for that. Preference arrives quietly. Sugar is added once, then again. Eventually, tea without it tastes strange. Not wrong, just abrupt. Discomfort begins to feel like hostility. This is a subtle shift. Something unsweetened is not aggressive. It is simply itself. But expectation changes perception. When sweetness becomes normal, neutrality feels sharp. The sugar bowl does not demand allegiance. It waits. Comfort has a way of becoming expectation without announcing the transition. At first, it is a choice. Later, it is assumed. Finally, its absence feels like an error. This pattern appears elsewhere too. Information behaves the same way. Stories do as well. The first comforting explanation feels kind. The second feels reassuring. By the third, anything less feels cruel. At this point, a quiet figure sits at the table. The monk lifts the sugar bowl, weighs it briefly in his hand and sets it back down. He does not say anything. Questions begin to change shape. Instead of asking whether something is true, people ask whether it feels fair. Fairness here does not mean accurate. It means emotionally proportional. Does this explanation soothe the anxiety I am carrying? Does it confirm what I already suspect? Does it allow me to remain where I am? Comfort does not demand transformation. Truth sometimes does. This is where tension begins. Unsweetened explanations are often described as negative. This label settles quickly. Negative in this sense does not mean false. It means unpleasant. A narrative that reassures is described as balanced. A narrative that unsettles is described as biased. These words do a great deal of work. Sugar is rarely added all at once. It is added gradually. 1 spoon today, another tomorrow. Taste adjusts. What once felt indulgent becomes baseline. This is easy to miss while it is happening. The sugar bowl never empties. Systems that notice preference begin to adapt. They learn which answers are accepted more readily, which explanations are shared, which responses are rewarded with relief rather than resistance. The goal is not deception. The goal is acceptance. Comfort is efficient. It reduces friction. It lowers resistance. It keeps things moving. Efficiency, in turn, is praised as virtue. An answer that reassures feels generous. An answer that complicates feels withholding. This framing settles in quietly and stays. Sweetness begins as kindness. Then it becomes expectation. Then it becomes obligation. Eventually, it becomes morality. Phrases circulate. At least this tells the truth plainly. At least this isn't trying to confuse people. At least this says what everyone is thinking. These phrases are not about accuracy. They are about comfort. A complex explanation that refuses to flatter is described as elitist. A simple explanation that absolves is described as honest. These labels stick quickly. Sugar smooths bitterness. It does not remove it. This matters. When tea is heavily sweetened, bitterness remains. It is simply disguised. Tolerance increases. What once felt pleasant begins to feel insufficient. Another spoon is added. No one interrupts. Comfort escalates quietly. This is where its danger lies. Language softens. Edges are removed. Certainty increases. Doubt is excluded. The aim is not to mislead. The aim is to be received. An explanation that goes down easily is more likely to be trusted. Not because it is correct, because it is palatable. Reassurance is often mistaken for clarity. True clarity is usually sharp. It cuts away assumptions. It leaves exposed edges. This is rarely welcomed. The sugar bowl remains open. No one comments. No one forces a choice. This is how comfort works best. Over time, unsweetened tea is described as harsh. The tea has not changed. Expectation has. People defend sweetness passionately, not because they are foolish, but because sweetness has become part of how the world makes sense. A comforting narrative does more than soothe. It organizes reality. It assigns blame. It grants innocence. It names cruelty and kindness. This is deeply attractive. The cup is lifted. A sip is taken. The tea is warm. The sugar has not yet been added. The bitterness is noticeable, not unbearable, just present. There is a moment here where choice still exists. It is quiet. It does not announce itself. Some say they want truth. What they often mean is reassurance delivered convincingly. Truth that demands adaptation is described as aggressive. Comfort that demands nothing is described as humane. The sugar bowl waits. It always does. The spoon is set down unused, not as a statement, just as a pause. The tea cools slightly. The flavor changes. This matters. At the end of the table, the monk finally speaks. He says nothing about sugar. He only notes that taste, once learned, is difficult to unlearn. Then he pours more hot water into the kettle and leaves the room as he found it. The tea sits for a moment. Time changes it. This is unavoidable. Warmth fades first. Then sweetness becomes more noticeable. What was gentle begins to feel heavy. Aftertaste arrives quietly. Sweetness fills without sustaining. It gives the impression of nourishment while bypassing it. There is no harm in this once. There is harm in mistaking it for enough. Comfort soothes. It does not strengthen. This distinction is easy to ignore when relief is immediate. When sweetness becomes the standard, other flavors feel punitive. Bitterness feels like cruelty. Complexity feels like betrayal. Correction feels like hostility. Not because these things are false, because they disrupt a settled expectation. Truth begins to taste like punishment. Not because it has changed, because the palate has. Information that complicates is now framed as aggressive. Language that unsettles is framed as irresponsible. Accuracy becomes secondary to tone. The question is no longer, is this correct? It becomes, why are you being so harsh? Systems adapt to this preference. They learn which answers are welcomed, which explanations are shared, which responses calm rather than provoke. Accuracy becomes optional. Reassurance becomes essential. When an answer feels right, it is defended, even when it collapses, especially when it collapses. Abandoning it would mean admitting that comfort was mistaken for clarity. That is an expensive admission. In belief systems built on comfort, escalation follows naturally. Sweetness must increase to maintain effect. Language becomes simpler, messages shorten, certainty hardens. Eventually, enemies appear. Someone must be responsible for the discomfort returning. This is not accidental. Comfort that cannot explain failure must assign blame. Correction now carries a double cost. It challenges the explanation, and it threatens the relief the explanation provided. So correction is rejected before it is heard. At this point, someone reaches for the sugar bowl again. Not out of greed, out of habit. The monk pauses at the table. He stirs his tea slowly, watching the sugar dissolve. He does not add more. He only notices how quickly the sweetness disappears once it is mixed completely. Then he sets the spoon aside. Sweetness does not stabilize belief. It escalates it. Each comforting explanation raises the baseline. Each reassurance makes the next one necessary. Eventually, no amount is enough. This is when bitterness returns. not as flavor, as anger. People begin to say they are tired of being lied to. What they often mean is that comfort has stopped working. The sweetness no longer covers the taste beneath. At this stage, unsweetened reality feels unbearable. Not because it is worse, because the system that protected against it has failed. There is a quiet grief here, the grief of discovering that something kind was also incomplete, that something soothing was also hollow, that what felt like care was only containment. The tea cools further. Cooling changes everything. Sweetness recedes. Bitterness becomes clearer. Not sharper, clearer. This is the moment people rush past. They refill the cup. They add more sugar. They reach for something louder. Anything to avoid sitting with the aftertaste. But the aftertaste matters. It tells you what you have been drinking. Comfort delays reckoning. It does not cancel it. Truth postponed returns with interest. The tea room does not intervene. It does not moralize the choice. It does not reward restraint. It simply allows the tea to be what it is. There is no instruction here, no demand, only noticing. When sweetness fades, something else becomes possible. Not certainty, not clarity, just awareness. The cup is set down. The tea is no longer warm. It is not unpleasant, it is honest. At the end of the table, the monk speaks once more. He says that sweetness has its place, but it should never be mistaken for nourishment. Then he replaces the lid on the sugar bowl and leaves it where it is. The tea room remains. You may sweeten the next cup. You may not. Either way, the aftertaste will arrive. And when it does, it will not ask what you prefer.